So I think talking about the Arab Maghreb is to do with the majority who are living in this land, and talking about the uh, Arab Maghreb relates perhaps with Arab pan Arabism or nationalism. I don't think that this is feasible. Perhaps practically speaking, the Arab Maghreb did not lead to any solutions internally and bilaterally or perhaps multilaterally. So that's why I just wanted to liberate ourselves of the term the Arab Maghreb. Otherwise, perhaps we will delve into certain problems that relate to the futile or the futility of this uh, term. As I said, we have ethnicities in Libya in the south that liaise with the African countries in the south rather than with the Arabs. There is also uh, multi components of the identity itself. The identity has not been determined conclusively in our countries. The other issue, perhaps, is to do with the countries of the region, i.e., the regimes. The regimes did not uh, conform with the populace. These countries are modern in their establishments. Here, we are talking about the nation states concept that is new amongst us, and we perhaps unconsciously try to clone different experiences. The EU, for example, incorporates a number of countries who depended on the nation state in the 17th century, and they went the extra mile in building the collective identity to deal with diversity, with the rights, with the political regimes and the balances between the society's forces. And then, after lengthy negotiations, we ended up with the EU, albeit we do understand that the EU is suffering now because of the Brexit and because of other issues as well. So these advanced countries in the systems, they regress and they are facing setbacks led by Britain, and perhaps some other countries will dissociate themselves from the EU. So hence we think that locally speaking, we need to understand our identity and we need to understand the socioeconomic systems that were not founded on solid grounds. And there are certain contradictions between our countries. There is no balance between our countries. I think that states can be built not on constitutions per se, and we understand that the USA's constitution is the most experienced, most applicable constitution across uh, 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 the planet. But perhaps our constitutions might resemble a tissue that we wipe our hands with and then we throw away. And because we do understand that these constitutions are amended time and time again very easily. And we heard the constitutional amendments in Egypt, and we hear that al-Bashir in Sudan wanted to be a president post 2021, despite the fact that there are protests in the streets of Sudan. So the problem in the Maghreb, if the term is sound, albeit I have my own reservations, I think that in Europe, uh, the other countries follow democracy, all the countries follow capitalism, and there are interactions between the societies thereby, and thus they inched closer to having interplays, uh, concerted kind of efforts to uh, kind of be together for their own interest. However, in our countries, the issue is different. So, from my perspective, I think that we need to re-establish a balance, re-strike a balance in our countries in order to have our states entrenched. In Libya, for example, we have no state, and I can say this frankly. Libya had no state entrenched in the society. It is just a settlement of people that was established without raising the awareness of the state, because there are certain infightings that are regional, ethnic, as well as other crises that have befell on Libya. So Libya cannot be perhaps an effective member, cannot liaise with other countries effectively, despite the fact that Libya had uh, uh, its problems exported to other countries, to other neighboring countries. As a matter of fact, we don't have much problems on the borders. However, at the same time, Libya is not eligible to be a member of the Arab States League or the Arab Maghreb, uh, because we don't have a balance in Libya. We don't have a crystal clear economic system. We don't have a social system, a social contract that determines the relationship. As a matter of fact, the political isolation law is one of other phenomena. We do have displaced persons, IDPs, in Libya, and this has nothing to do with the political isolation law or the political estrangement law. It is to do with the non-acceptability of the others. Some people were persecuted and they left their countries as a matter of fact, and consequently trying to perhaps talk about the Arab Spring as if it is the whole issue in the Maghreb is futile. Uh, we had problems before the Arab Spring, and we're having problem after the Arab Spring. And just as a way of digression, I think the Arab Spring is a status of wrath. It reflected the uh, societal explosion that the Libyans faced uh, uh, a lot of what took place during the previous regime. One of the brothers said, would it be possible for a revolution to be based on a project? I think if we talk about the populace cannot have a project in place. The elite can have a project in place, but the elite is facing a problem as well, as my brothers said. Sisters, there are problems in the five Maghreb countries. The issue is tense and problematic, and the binary vision of uh, differentiating between a government from one hand and an opposition from another, I think is futile as well. The opposition, when it took the helm of power after the Arab Spring, proved that it is on a par with the previous regimes, and thus I think that there is a problem, there is an intrinsic problem in the education, in the reforms, and as well as the other issues. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Ismail. What Mr. Ismail had floated is a core uh, problem that relates to the foundation of regional entities. I belong to a generation that kept the pace with the foundation of the Maghreb Arab Maghreb Union in 1987, and this made a sensation, and it reverberated in the minds of the Maghreb populace. However, 30 years after the foundation of this union, organizing a summit for the Maghreb was an event in itself. So, as a matter of fact, we, as the inhabitants of the Maghreb, or the rulers and the ruled, uh, uh, participated in evacuating the essence of the Arab Maghreb. So, Mr. Ismail has posed the question, do we have to start from the base, following certain agreements and certain interests, or do we have to start from the top of the pyramid? Uh, uh, and this is debatable indeed. The fourth and final panelist, and I hope he will abide by the time. He is Omar Sheikhna, and he combines the political activism with the academic research. He is the head uh, of the Wifaq al-Watani trend in Mauritania, and he's an academic who has a PhD from the Political Sciences University in Tunisia, and he will be talking about the Maghreb integration and democracy, because democracy is part and parcel of this composition, and it is an ambition for all the inhabitants of the Maghreb, especially after the regional and international transformations that we've witnessed. Yes, please. In the name of God, the most gracious, the most merciful, the Arab Maghreb comprises plenty of power. However, at the same time, it is weak. Political scientists believe that the power related formula depend on culture, demography, geography, military prowess, technology, as well as strategic planning and the political will of the policymaker. In the Arab Maghreb, the fixed data are there. There are certain indicators that can be developed when it comes to the variables. However, the third component is weak. The political will is not there. The strategic planning is not there. I think the Achilles tendon is to do with the lack of democracy. The lack of democracy in the Maghreb space is the main reason for the fragility of the state and the problems that we're facing. By and large, democracy in the Arab Maghreb relates to a hybrid system. It is not authoritarian and it is not democratic per se. That is deep rooted. There is a main reason for such hybrid status, and it is to do with the weakness of the state. Our countries suffer from the weakness of the state. The state is fragile. I don't mean that it is not power when it comes to the security. It is powerful, but at the same time, it's weak. And the weakness can be manifest on three levels. The first one is to do with the challenges that relate to the national unity. Uh, there is also a non-responsive kind of institutions that depend on clientelism and cronyism and so on and so forth. And there is also the weak economy that depends on imports, and it lacks the potential to provide welfare to the populace. So these kind of three components do overlap amongst each other. In order to get to a well-entrenched democracy, we need to have a powerful state in the first place. And because because of the non-responsive of the state institutions, because of the weak economy, because of the divided society, the divided economy that has ethnic-related problems, frictions between the ethnicities, cultural problems, as well as regional problems that can be implicit or explicit, but they are manifest indeed in reality. So we have uh, uh, we have problems that relate to certain groups that supersede the state. The army, like in Algeria and Mauritania, deep state in Tunisia, and militias in Libya. And these supra state groups make add insult to injury. The solution, I think, is to do with entrenching democracy as well as a powerful state. Do we have to have a powerful state in line with democracy, or do we have to get to the democracy before getting to a powerful state? This is the question. Why nations fail? This is a title of a book. It studied the experiences of the globe for the last 4 centuries, and it transpired that there is a crystal clear result. Most of the problems that relate to the lack of democracy and the feebleness of the economy uh, are to do with the lack of democratic institutions and authoritarianism. This can be changed. In Botswana, in Mauritius, these two countries, they were independent, but albeit they became democratic, their institutions are entrenched, and the GDP per capita indeed is on a par with Scandinavian countries, and they are very small countries, and they face the same problem that we face. There's also another challenge that we are facing, and it is to do with the presidential encroachment, if I might say. We have presidential institutions that have absolute power, expansive powers, and they don't follow checks and balances. They are expansive entities, but they are indeed away from any blame. In Mauritania, for example, in 1991, we had a constitution, but the commission that drafted the constitution was not known. In Tunisia, they had in place a constitution following consultations. That's why the common ground is very important. And thus, they rationalized the powers of the president, and they had into place institutions. And this is indeed a very important development. In Mauritania, we have a president who has absolute power. There's also another problem in the Arab Maghreb, i.e., the lack of the central hegemony on the army. In contrast to that, the army and the state-related security forces have the upper hand, and the checks and balances are not there. And the army focuses on the presidential seat per se, because if the army appoints the president, the army would pull the strings of power incessantly. In 2006, we had a declaration that talked about the non-interference in the constitutional articles. But we have another problem. We might not have an opposition in the near future because everybody will be sucking up to the president or the army generals, and this relates to the lack of democracy. Democracy can be a majority-related democracy or a participatory democracy. When it comes to those who have the majority, if you have 51%, then you have the upper hand, but the 49% won't have anything. When it comes to the countries that have powerful state, this is feasible, this is fine. You will have another opportunity to flip the formula and get to the power. However, in our countries, this will be a perpetual denial of the 49%, and that's why the second round of the elections will be different because the 49% will be denied the participation, will be denied all the rights. The other issue is as follows: there is a lack in the integration, and it has nothing to do with the uh, uh, difference in the regimes. Europe was integrated on the basis of the democracy. However, authoritarianism cannot lead to unity, cannot lead to integration. And Kant, in his book The Perpetual Peace, talks about the peaceful union between the democratic parties that depend on three dimensions. First, to settle the scores peacefully. Second, the international relationships depend on common values, and the other issue is the economic integration between the said countries. What takes place in our land is to do with the problems that are standstill. If we had democratic societies, then we could have solved the problem of the Western desert. Uh, Regardless of the regime, whether it is federalism or confederalism or otherwise. When it comes to the economic integration between our countries, it is still feeble, and because the borders are closed and the trade, as a matter of fact, is uh, meager. And Algeria can be blamed indeed in this because it is a huge country, and France wanted to be in Algeria for a lengthy period of time, and that's why it built a map that was huge, and this had led to friction between the Maghreb countries after independence. If we had a democratic authority in Algeria, then they would have risen above all such frictions, so that we could have an economic zone, and thus the friction would have dissipated. Democracy as well produces or emphasizes the unity of our governments to reflect the ambitions and aspirations of our populace. If the aspirations were met, then we would have ended up becoming democratic. I think the lack of democracy is the main bone here, the main problem. We need to have a pedagogical kind of lesson. We read our history, the Murabitun in Morocco and the Muwahhidun in Algeria. Everybody claims that the Muwahhidun were in Algeria and the Murabitun were in Morocco, and that's why the friction would still go ahead. But we need to, for this friction to be dissipated. Thank you, Mr. Umar. You have talked about uh, uh, what you call encroachment or the presidential absolute powers, and you have excluded the Tunisian model or example. And despite the fact that you have excluded Tunisia, I would like to say that there are certain efforts to uh, amend the constitution or change the constitution in order for such a presidential institution to be perhaps with certain powers rather than absolute powers, and to have indeed to entrench the separation between the powers as a principle. The gentleman has touched upon another important premise here. He said that authoritarianism is the stumbling block. When we talk about dictatorship or authoritarianism or repression and its manifestations, diverse manifestations, we look at them from the political angle, from the law or legal angle, but we turn a blind eye to the huge cost of development or raising awareness amongst the populace, because our population are poor because of despotism, because of authoritarianism, where transparency is lacking, and all the standards that provide us with good governance are lacking. There's no much time left. We'll open the floor for receiving your questions. I would like to reiterate the fact that the question ought to be succinct, and if you have to address a certain person, please do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The talks about the concept of the Arab Union and how it has developed where it did. This was one of the ideas of having a union of the coast and the desert, as-Sahel was Sahra. So my position was against the regime, but we have to say that there are certain aberrations that were very useful. So this union of the coast and the desert would guarantee such kind of diversity. And in actual fact, the point that was mentioned by Brother Ismail is worthy of discussion. Why Sudan is excluded? Why Egypt is excluded? Why these particular countries? I do belong to an era where we had the Arab Union or Arabism. So we have had this union that failed between Syria and Egypt, and we were very sad. And we did live this era when we have seen this kind of breakdown. So this was the idea in the GCC to have a in the Arab Maghreb to have a union, Sudan and Egypt to have a union, and so on and so forth, or unity. So the failure does not only lie in the heads of states, but also the peoples of those different countries. Very briefly, I would like to go back to an idea that is very important indeed, that was mentioned by Dr. Ismail in his intervention, talking about the uh, Arab Maghreb as a concept. I think we have to look into it as a historical development because we have to move and understand this transition. Is it complete? Is it not complete? Or studies underline from the first declaration that was in 1920 or 1921 in the Astana with Ali Pasha and the nationalists in the three countries have thought about the idea, and all the authorities and institutions including the students' unions and also the institutions of the Arab Maghreb in the 40s, including the Tangier Conference in 1958, was entitled the Arab Maghreb, and nationalists have added the Arab Maghreb, so Arab to Maghreb, and the occupiers used to call it North Africa because they wanted to give it a certain kind of dimension. So that is why they have added Arab to Maghreb. Is this an accurate kind of name? It is a it is a geographical concept, but that is not in keeping with the historical and civilizational and cultural content. So this context is much wider than the geographical kind of dimension. And after that, we have seen a number of namings, such as the Grand Maghreb, when we have had a number of components that are imposing their own demands, particularly the Amazigh, who are a very important component of this particular region, who started protesting against the Arab Maghreb, Arab as a description. And after that, we had the Grand Maghreb. And after that, we have seen in journalism the Maghribi, or Magharibi, Al Magharibiya, or the Maghribi, or the Maghrebian. I think we need to set a new identity through a new name. And I think that these formulas, these new names, are not going to be available unless we have to have a new vision for this kind of common or joint kind of space. This is not going to be easy. So we have one component or a number of components such as history, language, and religion, and these are not going to allow us to advance. But I think the positive interests, participation between different countries should have the most important kind of precedence. I do think I'm an MP from the I think that Mr. Lutfi, all the interventions that have been made by the distinguished speakers, I think there should be some differentiations in the intervention by Mr. Ismail or Omar, who talked about the countries as being similar. When we talk about the Tunisian constitution, Mr. Ismail, is not a constitution that can be changed anytime. So this constitution has been drafted not to allow others to draft the constitution in keeping with those people's inclinations. So although there is a will to do that, but it cannot be changed. The second point is similar to the first point. The intervention that was made by Mr. Munir when he talked about the different indicators, particularly the democracy indicator, but the second indicator that talked about the state of law, particularly the side that you talked about, and what is happening and the different cases that we see of death in the different security centers. These cases are cases in isolation, and the different human rights institutions and organizations are against what is happening. So what makes the ranking very low, because we were not being able to implement the law that combats bribes, corruption, and so on and so forth. These are phenomena that are very difficult to resist. That is why we have been classified so low and ranked so low as per the indicators. My last idea. So the non-activation of the Arab Maghreb is due to the fact that there is an absence of a political will. There are so many agreements that have been concluded between Algeria and Tunisia of exchange, free exchange, and so it is the will that is lacking here. We kindly ask the speaker to use the microphone. Iqbal Msadda from Tunisia. I am going to start from the following question. Why the Arab Maghreb? It is not a destiny in itself. It is not an objective, but it is a means. And this is what was expressed by Mr. Munir Ksho talking about la gouvernementalité moderne. It is a pledge to find solutions to the problems of the people. So if this was this the standpoint or the starting point of an Arab Maghreb, we would have been able to succeed and therefore achieve integration. If this is going to be the starting point into a union, and that should be on an economic perspective, first and foremost, as it happened in Europe, based on exchanges that aim to achieve common interests, irrespective of the cultural or geographical or civilizational differences or commonalities. Had we done so, we would have been able to be successful. I think that the economic side is the one that is absent. على الأقل, if we, or at least if we had based it on our interest, we would have been successful. So what is the impediment? I do not think that they do not appreciate or understand the outcomes that might be reached as a result of this cooperation. As Mrs. Louisa had said, we have to take into account that there are interests that are going to be hampered if we move into this direction. So we have some interests here. There are a number of financial institutions that have the upper hand when it comes to our directions and orientations, despite the fact that there are so many governments coming into power, even with the revolution that took place in Tunisia. The power, the authority takes its legitimacy not from the people and does not aim to please the people, but the financial institutions that are the ones that delineate our policies, which has led to the depreciation of our currency because the main aim is not the affluence of the people, but to please those leaders and people in charge of those institutions. I do agree with Mr. Ismail. In my opinion, this union, it is a regional kind of union that is one of the very limited kind of organizations in the world based on race and that have excluded the geographical factor. We are on borderline with so many cultures and civilizations. There are components within the Arab Maghreb that are non-Arab. We have the Amazighi component in particular. That is why to start from race as a starting point in setting the values of every union is going to be a failure. I do not agree that democracy cannot be achieved in the light of division or in the light of weakness. Democracy can be an effective ways in order to manage this kind of pluralism and difference and division. We have so many peoples that are divided from a linguistic, cultural, religious, and also geographical perspectives, and democracy was able to mend the differences. So, weakness is also the means to justify the lack of democracy. There are so many countries that were able to make it, such as Rwanda, Tanzania, Rwanda that has just exited from a war. We're talking about Mauritius and so many countries that achieve high levels of growth and were able to move from weakness into levels of development and growth. So we cannot compare between our situation with regard to the economic indicators compared to Rwanda, Ethiopia, and so on and so forth. Thank you, Mr. Abdulaziz. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like also to thank the Center for Mediterranean and International Studies and Al Jazeera Center for Studies for tackling this very strategic and sensitive topic. When we talk about the Arab Maghreb Union, that means to change the conditions of geography in order for us to be able to serve the strategic interests of people, the peoples of this region from an economic, cultural, and also social perspectives. Why? Why? We cannot confront the threats and risks of division, colonial divisions. This has become a necessity, a need. This is not a matter that falls in the hand of what is being useful or not. So this is a strategic matter. So to change the conditions of geography, that means moving geography. We got used to the fact, Mr. Chair, that geography is moved by the upper Mediterranean region. And now it is time for us to move our own geography, the southern part of the Mediterranean. We have always had our geography moved and changed at that basis. And this was built at that basis, on that basis. That is why we have had 5 unions with different kind of thoughts and ideas. And here we can talk about Le Grand Maghreb, the Grand Maghreb, because we not want to talk into the nationalistic dreams, because we do have joint and common kind of interests in order to set new conditions and also to give new themes for the different political effective components. How can we rebuild the conditions of the strong state, build a strong economy based on a unified kind of currency, and also to build a kind of a joint and common market. So the economists say that a strong economy can can be achieved by 100,000 and above. Thank you. I would like to thank the Center for Mediterranean and International Studies and Al Jazeera Center for Studies. I have two questions. What are the realities when it comes to CSOs in the Arab Maghreb in the light of democratic transformation and the impact on public policies? Is it a matter of services, and what is the role when it comes to regional dynamism in order to establish participatory kind of system and the participation of youth? So we have a problematic question with regard to the participation of youth in political life, and what are the incentives if there is any of such kind of participation. So what are the parameters and what are the bases upon which this is built? Thank you. Welcome. My name is Nawal Lawini from a civil society. My question is to Mr. Lakshaw. We in Tunisia and in many other Arab countries, all of them try to achieve a democratic classical system, and we hope that we are moving steadily towards such kind of an objective. The second point is democracy that we find in well-established democracies. So the question that should be posed, how successful these models are, how do they meet the needs and the requirements of their own people? This is what we see in France through the yellow vests. So my question, we are in this democratic kind of turmoil. How can we find a shortcut and try to set a democratic model that can be closer to a participatory kind of democracy or direct democracy? Mr. Muhammad Jamil and then Mr. Muhammad Hawass. We can't hear the gentleman. He's not using the microphone. In the name of God, the most compassionate. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So all the valuable interventions that have been made, I was amongst the people who were waiting for the Maghreb countries' relationships and the impact on the current situation. I was waiting for a detailed discussion about the Moroccan-Algerian situation, because this is the most important and impeding matter. We were awaiting the discussion about Algerian and Tunisian relations, the Libyan situation between the Maghreb position or location, and also the eastern ambitions. We were expecting talks about these matters, the impact of the deserts, the Sahara on the different relationships between Mauritania and Morocco, and particularly the Moroccan-Algerian relationship that plays a very important role when it comes to impeding this union or unity. I think that Arab is more of a civilizational cultural component and not racial component. This problematic remains, and the demands by non-Arab components in the Maghreb should be taken into account, and it's reasonable as well as demands. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the different professors. I have got an observation when it comes to the name given to the Arab Maghreb and taking this racial component, which is the Arab. So I remember Abdul Karim Khattabi, who was an Amazighi, and also other leaders who were Amazighi. So belonging to the Arab Maghreb did not entail the exclusion of Amazighis. It was looked at as something positive, as one culture, one ummah, a culture that people are proud of. So now, looking at it as an exclusion to the Amazighi, this is a late kind of observation, but the Amazighi leaders, they saw themselves belonging to this kind of space, but not excluding their own Amazighi vision. So this is something that came along afterwards, but not at the time of Abdul Karim al-Khattabi. So all the arguments, if they are in the interest of unifying the Arab Maghreb, my question that I would like to pose, why, despite all the losses that happen as a result of a non-Maghreb, why do the others insist of this non-Maghreb to stay? Why do they want this current situation should stay? I think this is a rational kind of matter because they think that the continuation of such kind of system would help and serve some of their priorities. Can you please tell us what makes these groups want to preserve the current situation, thinking that it is better than the opposite of such a situation? Would like to give the floor to the different lecturers to comment and answer the different questions. I have 1 minute to each and every panelist. Please, in general.
Yes, you can share the microphone if you wish. Yes, talking about the establishment of the Arab Maghreb now, talking about this idea is difficult within half a minute. I would like to focus on two issues when it comes to the identity. I agree with Mr. Mohammed. There is a difference between the cultural conditions and the ideological conditions that surrounded the Arab Maghreb in the past and the ones at present. I think that we had made good strides in the past, but I think that if we want to reactivate the issue, I think that Arabism will be looked at differently because of the different kind of conditions that surfaced in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya. Second, in response to Mr. Hawass, I think Morocco and what it wants and what it achieves in its relationship with the surrounding uh, space. I think that the neighboring countries uh, play a major role in the conviction of Morocco, i.e., its immunity or its capacity to weather the pressures relates to the extent of its control, the control of what takes place within the country, and this relates to the region. This relates to the borders, and that's why security-wise, the Maghreb countries resort to hard kind of vehicles or means rather than soft means, and that's why, as a matter of fact, when it comes to the security, some countries resort to the iron fist, and I would like to mention the immigration issue because the immigration issue can be put uh, at the same level of combating terrorism sometimes because This kind of role makes the Maghreb countries deal or treat the sub-Saharan immigrants uh, as the Western countries treat them. I think that this is schizophrenic kind of paradox. The last point, please. Yes, last point, please. Uh, when it comes to the economy, I think that the issue is similar. If we want to have an effective, sustainable economic development in the Maghreb countries, is difficult indeed if it cannot be accompanied by radical reforms because the economic and the political elite do kind of sleep in the same bed. And uh, despite the fact that some reforms have taken place, however, I think that they ought to be more entrenched. Thank you, Munir. When it comes to the observations by the parliamentarian, and I would like to thank him for his reaction vis-à-vis the indicators, especially the indicator of the rule of law. Tunisia ranks 54th, and the uh, indicator is 0.52, and Morocco is 0.57, and the rank is between 0 and 1. So the rank is not that bad, but there is a room for improvement. I would like just to go back to the principles of the rule of law, whereby the indicators can be calculated. First is accountability. Uh, Second is to have just frame uh, uh, or legal framework. Third is to have into place transparency when it comes to governance. And lastly, uh, problem solvings and to have a conclusive justice. The enforcement of law is difficult in Tunisia. We have certain judgments that are not enforced. We do have some municipalities that have been elected. Al Marsa or Ariana, heads of municipalities, say to us that we are remiss when it comes to apply certain uh, 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 rulings to destroy or demolish certain houses for those who are illegally occupying certain places. Indeed, there is also violations that relates to the traffic laws as well. Yes, when it comes to the economic Maghreb integration, we need to understand the following. When it comes to economic integration, it ought to be linked with the internal economic development of each country. And this is based on the rule of law. The gentleman, the Mauritanian gentleman, mentioned the title of the book, but he didn't mention the author. Asimoglu wrote Why the Nations Fail, and it was translated into Arabic and issued in Egypt. This is the bottom line here. How could we have a state of rule of law to provide the conditions of comfort to its populace? The most important issue here is nothing to do with the foreign intervention. It is to do with our own problems. The problems of the economy in Tunisia are based on three factors. First, it is to do with the economy that is based on fundraising. It is based on uh, subscriptions. It is based on subsidies, government subsidies. Um, as well as the public ownership. 90% of the companies are a failure, and that's why the government bails them out. There's also the issue of the what we call the salaries mass, and it is to the tune of 14%. And this means that our problem is intrinsic, and Tunisia ought to stretch bridges with the uh, uh, the IMF and other organizations because there is no solution, no other solution. The last part is to do with the model of democracy. Up to this moment, we don't have a different uh, uh, model apart from the classical democracy and what we call in the political sciences literature the liberal democracy. And what we mean by that is the political representation, parliament, I mean. Second, rule of law. Third, the constitution to protect the freedoms and the fundamental rights, as well as the mechanisms of orderly transition of power, peaceful transition of power. As far as the other parts are concerned, the participatory democracy as well as the deliberative democracy. These two, up to this moment, uh, did not prove that they supplant the classical democracy or the liberal democracy. And sorry, the microphone has been cut off. We cannot hear the gentleman. Microphone, please. Last point. The civil society cannot supplant the state. If it does so, this will be a catastrophe. The civil society ought to be an opposing power. It cannot become the power. And here, when it comes to the union of laborers in Tunisia, if it wants to be uh, uh, supplanting the government, then this would be a problem. Mr. Ismail, the question was addressed to you directly. Which was it? Sorry, I think they were observations rather than a direct question, and that's why I would like just to talk about an idea that I couldn't uh, uh, float clearly. Sorry for reiterating this idea. What takes place in the Maghreb or the Grand Maghreb, I don't want to use the word Arab. It is to do with the different crises, the internal crises in the different countries. As I said, there are discrepancies in the regimes. We know that the EU accepted the Eastern Bloc after the dissolution of the USSR, and after the Orange Revolutions and the Velvet Revolutions in the Eastern Bloc. The Eastern Bloc was accepted, but they were accepted after amending their internal kind of mechanisms. So there is a conformity, there is a coherence here. Um, Otherwise, if there is no coherence, if there is no institutional development, then the union will be a failure. As far as the state is concerned, I felt that you've talked about the lack of the state in the modern sense. Unfortunately, we live in an era of cloning what we had produced in the past. We kind of regurgitate rather. So we follow the trend in the north that is being uh, rejected by one of the speakers here. I think that we are in the state of sorry, the no, I cannot hear the gentleman. Something wrong. There is a technical hiccup. We do apologize. Oh, okay, the sound is back now. Right. When Western liberal democracy and when the book The Protestant Capitalism was authored, the solution was similar to the Western, and the economic solution can be only Western. However, China came along. The totalitarian country has more than 5% of the American bonds in the treasury, and it has the most dollar reserve, the hard currency reserve, and it played a major role economically, albeit it doesn't depend on the Western capitalism. So would it be possible for have to uh, uh, kind of have our own say in this? The gentleman is right. I would like to say that the weakness of the state is an obstacle to get to the democracy, entrenched democracy. Indeed, having the state strong is very important, but we cannot have it strong before getting to democracy. Botswana, for example, inherited the democracy from Britain. It was embryonic, however, it developed it, and through the institutions, and they depended on two points to have a neutral bureaucracy that is meritocracy, and in and also the representation of the Botswanian uh, tribes in this bureaucracy. So they had their own idiosyncrasy that took into consideration the idiosyncrasy of the tribal society as well as the embryonic democracy. Muhammad Jamil Mansour had talked about Algeria and Morocco. Indeed, France and Germany solve their own problems, and thus the EU indeed advanced. Algeria and Morocco are or do resemble Germany and France in the EU. If they do not cooperate with each other, then the Arab Maghreb Union won't get us nowhere. Thank you very much for your contribution. The second session will start in 1 hour, and now we're having a lunch, and we'll resume at 2:30 Tunisian time. Thank you.